Welcome to the I Will Restore podcast. I'm Dr. Denzel Waters, your host, your friend. Glad to just simply be here and share with you today. Had some time that been thinking about a few things that concern this time in which we're living. Today, June the 25th, 2020. The world is reaching for itself, changing. Reminds me of another set of changes that came about. The question becomes more than ever before. The changes on the individual, on the community, or on the national, international scale, are those changes brought about as a result of intentionality? Do those changes take place just because? Or what are the causes that bring about changes? What is the catalyst that brings about changes? And as I've looked at this particular presentation for this time, I've been reading an author whose name is Thomas Throwett. He's a very deep writer, writing in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And when I say deep, he is someone that goes through a process of rational thought. He begins at a point, thinks about it, moves from that point to the next logical step. What would be called just common sense. Others call it metaphysics, mental science, natural science, and I just like the progression of thought that he has. He has books that can be found at, it's called the Gutenberg Library. I think they still make those available. And those books gotten directly from the Gutenberg Library may include the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, the Doré Lectures, and others. And so I was reading the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. And what I love about what he is writing is, again, he's writing before there are computers, before there are flying airplanes, before a lot of the things that we enjoy today, like computers that we enjoy today, cell phones that we enjoy today. And one would think, how is it relevant to today? How's what he's saying relevant today? Well, I find it's very much relevant to today because he talks about principles and how they apply to timeless experiences, timeless. That what was true yesterday is true today, and it will be true tomorrow. It's called truth with a capital T. Truth with a capital T. And I have just been enjoying this entire process. There are others that take the same approach and make application to specific ideas, similar to what Thomas Thurwood. His name was normally called Judge Thomas Thurwood, and he lived a major part of his life in India, from what I have read. Major part of his life in India. In the item that I'm reading, he begins the discussion with the relationship between spirit and matter. What is that relationship? And really, a person, rather than necessarily listening to my presentations, a person should also get the material. And as I said, you can get the material from the Gutenberg Library. That's online. You can also email us at info@iwillrestore.com, and we can get that information to you. There's a requirement that we keep some things that are included in the Gutenberg download included in there, because these materials it is required that they be made available to you free of charge if they are given to you, because they come from the Gutenberg Library. And so them in themselves, without any additions to them, are absolutely free of charge. That's why I'm encouraging you to go direct to the Gutenberg Library and get these items. They're worth the read, and as you look at them, as you work with them, work your way through them, you can then consider the material that we're talking about in regard to this and make application to your own life. Many people have challenges when it comes to this type of material, and then the application part to your own life. I've had a lot of people who've helped me, and I have a lot of books that I read, and I do a lot of praying in regard to this so that I can process the material that I read. And I study and then I apply. I study and then I apply. I study and then I apply. And that's how I do life, honestly, to tell you the truth. So the first chapter is entitled Spirit and Matter. Spirit and Matter. And his discussion begins that the starting point is a relationship between spirit and matter. And an individual would do well to ask the question, what is the relationship between spirit and matter? What is spirit? What is matter? And what's the relationship between them two? And as he goes forward in regard to this discussion, he then arrives at the point where he calls that it seems that there's a natural opposition between the two. And he calls that living spirit and dead matter. And this is an interesting item because of living spirit and dead matter, as he calls it. Living spirit and dead matter. And you think about that. And he uses the word, it seems a natural opposition between the two. And he says here, considered only from the point of view of outward appearance, this impression is no doubt correct. Now, that's a setup if there ever was one. You know that there's something coming. There's something coming. If you did not know it, let me tell you, there's something coming. There's more coming. So notice the opposites: living spirit, dead matter. And so he keeps on writing in regard to this. And he then talks about the aspect of that we begin to understand what livingness consists of. What does it mean to be living? And he talks about the aspect that to be dead is the opposite of that. But what is really alive? What does it mean to be really alive? And he uses, say, a wood table. I know today we have plastic tables, and we have tables made out of, say, pressed wood and all of these kinds of things. And some people don't remember when there were indeed tables made out of wood or furniture made out of wood. I understand that. I do remember in my home there was a table made out of wood. And he mentions the fact that the table made out of wood, within the wood itself, there were cells, atoms, protons, electrons, neutrons that were moving at a very high rate of speed. And so there were things that were inside that were moving, and they were in motion. And so there was something that was taking place, so that livingness had to be determined by something more than just something that was moving. Livingness. Because we can look at the outward nature of a table and think that it is dead. And he said livingness has to be more. And when he finally comes down to it, he talks about the aspect of life. When we speak of livingness, at one particular level, it is more than that. And then he says that consider the aspect that there are degrees of life, and he again breaks it down to another consideration. And he begins to talk about that there is plant life, and then there's animal life, and then there is humans. And then he does another step. It says there are higher levels of thinking, intelligence, thinking when it is between one human and another. And this is vital, that a person understands this. I read a book previously. You may be familiar with an individual whose name is John Maxwell. I'm a John Maxwell certified coach. I run mastermind groups, coach individuals, all of those kinds of things. You should be coached by me. And he talks about what is called the law of the lid in one of his books called the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. And he mentions that an individual, every one of us, has a level of leadership ability as our present level of leadership ability. And he mentions the aspect that if the leadership ability goes from 1 to 10, that a person who is a 10 will not follow a 9. A person who is a 7 will not follow a 6. And so each person has a certain level of leadership. Well, when I was reading this material about intelligence, and that there's a difference between plant life, the amount of intelligence it has, compared to animal life, the amount of intelligence an animal has. Remember, animals normally move from the aspect of instinct. Animals move from instinct. Humans are different from plants. They're different from animals. Animals move from instincts. Plants, as far as we know, are not moving from instinct. And then humans have the ability, you will recall, to do something other than move from just instinct. If they are self-aware. I was first introduced to this idea, not just in regard to John Maxwell. It was also in a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, in which this man, Stephen Covey, when he talked about that, talked about the aspect that when a human was confronted with a stimulus, the human had the ability to consider a number of things. That person had the ability to consider their own consciousness, their self-awareness, their imagination, and their ability to make a decision. That's a human individual. That's a human individual. And so this is the same thing, or to a degree, the very same thing that's being said years before by Thomas Thorwood. He is saying that there are different levels of intelligence between humans. Different levels of intelligence. So you have a human, but then there is the aspect of the human, the level of intelligence between one human and another. Now, this is vital for understanding, because initially what's so powerful about this, what brought me to this particular presentation here, is that he started talking about what is called the survival of the fittest. Remember, you got living spirit and dead matter. And he's talking about the aspect that the spirit is alive, matter is dead by itself, or so it seems. And he is placing this idea of defining exactly, looking deeper at this idea of what is living spirit. What exactly is it that distinguishes that which is living? And then he's looking at the point at which you combine really spirit and matter. And of course, if you jumped ahead, and I'll come back to this, but if you jumped ahead, you know that the human is a combination of spirit and matter, because matter is something that is found in a form. Spirit is not found in a form. Form means that something occupies space. Something occupies space and it has a particular form, which means there are certain limitations to it. It is so big and so wide and those kinds of things. There are certain limitations to it. So that's another distinction between spirit and matter. Spirit does not have a form. Spirit does not have a form. In spirit itself, pure spirit does not have a form. And he's talking about that. There's another distinction that is vital in regard to this as we move through it and everything. And that is this matter of time. This matter of time. When it comes to time, time is a construct that says you started at one place, and then time is how you got from one space. Form has space. It occupies a particular space, has a particular form, and is located in a particular place. It can be located. And so the form is in one place, and then it moves to another. And it takes a certain amount of time in order for it to move. So you can plot it from one place to the other. And so you have the time it was in one place, and then the time it moves to another place, and in between is the interval of time. Spirit, pure spirit, is not bound by time. Pure spirit is not bound by time. For pure spirit, it is always now. Past, present, and future. It is always now, is what he says. It is always now. Whatever the moment is, it's now for pure spirit. And so, as we mentioned, that the human is a combination of spirit and matter. Spirit and matter. The Spirit of God dwells in the human. The Spirit of God dwells in the human body. And the biblical account, of course, when you look at this particular item, if you read the biblical account, and there are other accounts, other creation stories that you could be familiar with. One of the earliest, I believe, was called the Gilgamesh account, if I remember correctly. I may be incorrect in regard to that. I'd have to find it. That may be just another story that I'm thinking of, but there is another creation account as well. Gilgamesh may be a different story altogether, but there are other creation accounts that talk about how creation came about, how humans came about in regard to that. Let me stay with this for a moment here. In regard to this particular item, we have this item where you have spirit and form, spirit and matter, spirit and matter. And what he is talking about is that a distinction between spirit and matter is that spirit has the ability to be intelligent or to think, and that there are higher levels of thinking that goes on. And eventually he comes to this discussion that has to do with the survival of the fittest. And he says at one point that previously, when a person was not necessarily conscious, or when beings were not necessarily conscious, survival of the fittest was a law of averages. And that in animal life, in human life, that what would take place was that an individual species or type, their survival came about as a result of, you might even say something like mass production almost, is that creation, God, the universe, would make so many of them, so many of a type, he calls it, so many of a species, and yet so many of them would die or not live on. And so it seemed to be almost like carelessness on the part as far as the single individual was concerned. But the certainty was that the type would continue. So that's what is called the survival of the fittest. This is what's fascinating. But as man, the human, got more and more intelligent, there was this thing called volition, or the will, that came into play. And what would take place is it became not just the survival of the fittest, it became the survival of the intelligent. Because it became possible to use matter in order to master the creation itself. It became possible for that which is both spirit and matter to use things of matter in order to master the creation itself and to prolong the life, not just of the strong, physically strong, but of the intelligently strong. Now, this is a phenomenal thing. As I read this in regard to this item, I thought about so many things, from the building of the pyramids to the computer, the cell phone, the smartphone, the moment that we're in on January or June 25th, 2020, and beyond. Remember that spirit is not bound by time. Spirit is not bound by time. And so there is this. Let me read this particular item from the book. It's chapter 2 of this. The higher mode of intelligence controls the lower. We've seen that the descent from personality, as we know in ourselves, to matter, as we know it under what we call inanimate forms, is a gradual descent in the scale of intelligence from that mode of being which is able to realize its own willpower as a capacity for organizing new trains of causation to that mode of being which is incapable of recognizing itself at all. The higher the grade of life, the higher the intelligence from which it follows that the supreme principle of life must also be the ultimate principle of intelligence. This is clearly demonstrated by the grand natural order of the universe. In the light of modern science, the principle of evolution is familiar to us all, and the accurate adjustment existing between all parts of the cosmic scheme is too self-evident to need insisting upon. Every advance in science consists in discovering new subtleties of connection in this magnificent universal order, which already exists and only needs our recognition to bring it into practical use. If, then, the highest work of the greatest minds consists in nothing else than the recognition of an already existing order, there's no getting away from the conclusion that a paramount intelligence must be inherent in the life principle which manifests itself as this order, and thus we see that there must be a grand cosmic intelligence underlying the totality of things. The physical history of our planet shows us first an incandescent nebula dispersed over vast infinitudes of space. Later, this condenses into a central sun surrounded by a family of glowing planets hardly yet consolidated from the plastic primordial matter. Then succeeds untold millenniums of slow geological formation, and Earth peopled by the lowest forms of life, whether vegetable or animal, from which crude beginnings a majestic, unceasing, unheard forward movement brings things stage by stage to the condition in which we know them now. Looking at this steady progression, it is clear that, however we may conceive the nature of the evolutionary principle, it unerringly provides for the continual advance of the race, the human race. But it does this by creating such numbers of each kind that, after allowing a wide margin for all possible accidents to individuals, the race shall still continue. So careful of the type it seems, so careless of the single life. The human continues. Though the human, individual human, passes on. In short, we shall say that the cosmic intelligence works by the law of averages, which allows a wide margin of accident and failure to the individual. But the progress toward higher intelligence is always in the direction of narrowing down this margin of accident and taking the individual more and more out of the law of averages and substituting the law of individual selection. In ordinary scientific language, this is the survival of the fittest. The reproduction of fish is on the scale that would choke the sea with them if every individual survived, but the margin of destruction is correspondingly enormous, and thus the law of averages simply keeps up the normal proportion of the race. But at the other end of the scale, reproduction is by no means thus enormously in excess of survival. True, there is ample margin of accident and disease cutting off numbers of human beings before they have gone through the average duration of life, but still it is on a very different scale from the premature destruction of hundreds of thousands as against the survival of one. It may therefore be taken as an established fact that in proportion as intelligence advances, the individual ceases to be subject to the mere law of averages and has a continually increasing power of controlling the conditions of his or her own survival. That becomes a very powerful statement, because what takes place is that it's a matter of the individual understanding that he or she, by his or her decisions, he or she, by his or her own intelligence, that person is making the decision, or that family is making the decision about the length of their life, the duration of their kind, all of those things. And so there's a desire, at least on my part, to say that we should be very, very intentional in our reading, in our study, in our understanding of how the world is run. It is vital that we not only be entertained, it is vital that we become empowered. I hear thunder as it seems that a storm is coming in, and thunder is a very interesting thing in itself, because it can be a very signal from the divine. I'm going to pull this to an end, but I want you to think about this and its ramifications for what we're involved with. We've got more people on the streets than we've ever seen in my lifetime. We also need more people in the books, studying, being taught, being coached, because we have the opportunity now, with the access to information, to prepare for a change in the world. I mean a literal change in the world in one generation. But we need people also to be as equipped to do this intellectually. Remember, it's a matter of intelligence, intellectually. It's these individuals who we've seen in the hearings that we've had in regard to Congress, the various times when we've seen witnesses that have come and had almost photographic memories of various events and everything like that. And we've seen the portrayal of individuals, whether it's on television or other places, who've been able to do numbers at a superb level, who have numbers stored in their minds, and for numbers as far as formulas and all of those kinds of things. I mean, individuals who are extremely intelligent in their fields. And my plea in regard to this, beyond all of this aspect of the metaphysics of what I'm talking about, because I just think that this stuff that I'm saying is indeed pre-science. It is pre-science. There are people who spoke hundreds of years ago about stuff that we're talking about today in the scientific world. I tell people that I had a comic book when I was growing up, or a comic script really, that was in the newspaper. It was called Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy on his arm had a phone. It appeared to be a watch, but it was a phone, in which on his watch phone, he could see the person that he was talking with. Today, we have a cell phone that can do FaceTime. Somebody knew, now I'm 67 years old, somebody knew then what we are experiencing now. And they prepared to move us forward then to where we are now. I was not one of those somebodies, but somebody knew. And I would say, in regard to what I'm reading here, is that somebody knows now where we will be 60 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 300 years from now, and beyond. Those people are preparing for that. And if we will be participants in this world, we must do the same thing. You enter that realm by virtue of the use of your intelligence, the use of your imagination to be able to stand in that space where there is no such thing as time. And if that frightens you, if that makes you afraid, if that makes anybody afraid, then you can't go in that space. You just can't go. But rest assured, do not blame others who are dare courageous enough, who go in that space and understand that there's a place where there's timelessness. It's not really a space, it's just spirit, which we all are. Blessings. I'll come back in a little bit and talk some more. For now, take care. Email us at info@iwillrestore.com. And as I said, just blessings upon you. Think about what we've talked about already. It is a marvelous experience that we're having as we read the books. It's just a marvelous experience. Spirit speaking to spirit. I want to encourage you again to make contact with us. info@iwillrestore.com. We call this the I Will Restore podcast. We are reaching people we know around the world. Make contact with us so that we can participate in your evolution, your growth. For now, take care. God bless you.